When a tzadik says that I feel inadequate because of Hashem's incredible brachas, and maybe I don't even necessarily deserve to have those brachas fulfilled, as Yaakov Avinu said and the Alter Rebbe said after his release, the tzaddik does not mean chas v'shalom that they may have done something wrong. Rather, they're describing the radical transformation that happens from one level to another, as we shall see. Commenting on the pasuk, where Yaakov Avinu says, after returning back to Eretz Yisrael, on his way back to Eretz Yisrael, that he has been humbled by all the great brachas that Hashem has given him. His Mevoret Alter Rebbe in Zayin Igeres HaKodesh. There's a well-known letter from the Alter Rebbe in Igeres HaKodesh, which the Alter Rebbe penned after having been released from prison. So the Alter Rebbe explains that every kindness was the Eibishter tut mit mention. Every time that the Eibishter bestows on us some kind of a kindness, that should make us much, much more humble. So the more chesed you get from the Eibishter, the closer you are to the Eibishter, the greater you feel bittul to the Eibishter, until the extent that you feel that you're absolutely nothing, which makes sense. As you get closer to the source, you realize that you pale and disappear into the background. That's why Yaakov Avinu said, I have been humbled or made small by all of the kindness that the Eibishter showed me. After all the incredible goodness that the Eibishter did for Yaakov Avinu, Yaakov's self-perception was that he's much smaller. Because that is the principle. The closer you get to the Eibishter, the less you feel conscious of self and certainly of the value of self. Now, Rashi says, Rashi ala pasuk, maybe a little differently to the Alter Rebbe. Rashi says, because remember that Rashi is pshat, so Rashi says, Imi. That Yaakov Avinu says, my merits have been decreased because I've kind of used up a whole lot of them because of the kindness that you showed me. And therefore, says Rashi, maybe since the Eibishter promised me that he's going to protect me and look after me, maybe I have sullied myself with the chatoim, and maybe therefore I am susceptible to Esav having control over me. This is Yaakov speaking. So that is Pshutei Shomikra. That's Rashi telling us the simplest understanding of the pasuk. As Masber for Yaakov, which is to explain why Yaakov Avinu said, "Please save me from Esav." Despite the fact that he had a direct undertaking from the Eibishter that he's going to protect him, and not only that, that the Eibishter said he'll be with him. So why is Yaakov second guessing that now? As Dos is given that's because, says Rashi, Yaakov Avinu was afraid. Shema that maybe in the interim, since that promise was made till now, maybe I've done something that is not appropriate, and that could diminish that value, that bracha, that protection. So now the Alter Rebbe is meforish a Torah, whereas the Alter Rebbe is positioning it not as an explanation of why Yaakov is asking for protection in the face of Esav despite the bracha, but rather he's saying it's a generalized lesson for us. It's a generic lesson that applies to every single Jewish person. That any time that we feel that the Eibishter is showing us kindness, it should humble us. And das ist euch Essen zum Chilek Eifen zwischen Yaakov und Kotonti und dem Eifen für Alter Rebbe schreibt the Igeres HaKodesh. In fact, the circumstances under which Yaakov Avinu said the word Kotonti and the circumstances where the Alter Rebbe said Kotonti are very different circumstances. Because Yaakov hat es gesagt als Tefillah Bakosha. Yaakov is facing a threat and therefore he's asking the Eibishter for protection. Weil ist gestanden, mit der Matzah Shatzakon und hat mehr gehabt for Esav. And he's being threatened by Esav and he's afraid of Esav. And therefore he's asking the Eibishter to still protect him. The Rebbe is mamaz b'ti sibay sein which is why Rashi has to explain why is Yaakov afraid. He has a promise that the Eibishter will look after him because he says maybe there was a chet along the way that diminished my rights to this bracha. The Alter Rebbe, on the other hand, is in a completely different circumstance. He wrote Kotonti after having escaped the danger and having left prison. On der Geras is beachdem haidot zum Eibish and Hairav Hasar Tzchsidim, and here not only is the Alter Rebbe giving gratitude to Hashem for the miracle of his release, but he's giving instruction to the Chassidim. As you can see in the language that the Alter Rebbe uses, he says, "I'm giving a public statement to Anash because of the incredible kindness that the Eibish did for us. Nobody should get onto their high horse. Nobody should feel that they now have the right to behave in a particular way towards those who are the antagonists of Chassidus, etc. So in that set of circumstances, when the miracle has already happened, there's no imminent danger, then it makes sense to say that the more kindness a person experiences from the Eibishter in their life, the more humble that they have to be. So that we get. But there is something that we do have to understand, and that is, why would there be this doubt in Yaakov's mind? Why is Yaakov in fact concerned? And maybe the promise that Abishta made to him has been weakened by some kind of a chet. And we're talking about Yaakov Avinu over here. How is it even a suggestion? Okay, the fact that he says that I've used up credits because I've had all these miracles, that makes sense. Because the Gemara tells us clearly that when a person experiences a miracle, it is taken off the merits that they had collected through their behavior and dedication to the Eibishter. So we can understand why Yaakov would be concerned that maybe he had, so to speak, lost some of his credits. That's a completely different concept to saying, I'm worried, maybe there's some chet that has completely undermined the entire promise that the Eibishter made to me. That's a major distinction from just saying, I've used up some of my credits. So we have to understand, why is Yaakov thinking that? And we actually have a similar question with regards to Alter Rebbe. Because from them was Alter Rebbe bringt in der Geras HaKodesh Gufa. In the Geras HaKodesh, which is after the Alter Rebbe has already been rescued from prison, and now he's giving gratitude to the Eibishter and teaching us how to behave, that we should always be humbled by the Eibishter's brachas. But he still says, not only does he tell us that this is a trait which we learn from Yaakov Avinu, but he continues, and he says, that's why Yaakov explained his fear of Esav, and he didn't just simply rely on the fact that David had promised him that he'd be with him and protect him. It's because Yaakov Avinu, after seeing all of the kindness that David showed him, fulfilled what the Alter Rebbe is teaching us, which is to be very humble and see yourself as small, and therefore he thought he didn't deserve to be saved and helped. As the Gemara says, that a person could feel maybe they did an avera for which they lost the protection or the promise of the Eibishter that they had been given. And Yaakov Avinu thought maybe that's the same for him. So the fact that the Alter Rebbe includes that in that letter of Kotointi is mashma, that implies two things. Aleph, as the Pirish von Alter Rebbe in Kotointi Gomer, as das der Bitte was kommt mit Tzad Ribach Sod mit Tzad Kirbas Hashem. That when the Alter Rebbe explains to us that Kotointi means when you feel that the Eibishter is close to you, the natural feeling should be one of humility and feeling small, is Farbonamit and Pirish HaPashad. That is directly linked to the simple understanding of that pasuk and the context where Yaakov said it, as das meint the Murif von Yaakov that is linked. That feeling of being humbled should then evoke a feeling of, well, maybe I've done something that's not aligned with what the Eibishter wants, and I've lost the promise of his protection. Secondly, if the Alter Rebbe includes that in Kotointi, that implies that the Alter Rebbe is thinking something similar after having come out of Peterburg. In other words, also thinking almost Shema Yigroi Machet. Svea Shloimar, as dem Hit Meinterech zum Ramazan, which implies that the Alter Rebbe is hinting at, as ne kukendik der Ruf, was noch seindig in Twisse, oder gehat der Aftoche von Baal Shem Tov and Magid. The Alter Rebbe came out of prison with an assurance from both the Baal Shem Tov and the Magid who had visited him when he was in prison. They promised him he'd be released. And they promised him that he'd be able to spread Chassidus in far greater measure than he had done previously. So he had a promise, similar to how Yaakov Avinu had a promise. And still he's asking the Eibishter that everything should be good. It's not moving, so it also doesn't make sense. How could Yaakov Avinu, and now in this case, the Alter Rebbe, worry that they had done something misaligned, a chet, and therefore lost the Eibishter's promises or the Baal Shem Tov and Magid's promises to them? Why? So the simplest answer to give is that as a person grows, so they're held to a higher standard, and so what previously may not have been considered something which is a chet, perhaps now is. So that's the overall explanation, but we'll actually drill it down into something very specific. As we progress to a higher spiritual level, and something which at a lower stage was not considered a chet, in a At a higher level, that is a big deal. So, for example, the Talmid Chacham who has a stain on his clothing is considered a negative thing. For the regular person, it's not a big deal. Why is that? And the pshat in them is, the explanation is, what this means is, so the surprise wouldn't be to say, okay, look, Previously, in that position, if you did X and Y, nobody would look at you. But now if you do that thing going forward, it's going to be a problem. But it actually means much more than that. Now, the Friedrich shown of Gitonenamaise, something I did which was acceptable at a previous level of behavior, was b'shas asiyos is in nitachet. It wasn't an Avera. That's why Yaakov, at a certain stage of his development, might have behaved in that way. The Alter Rebbe, at a certain stage, might have behaved that way. And now we've taken that person up a notch, and now we're reviewing things that were part of their past, and we judge them. And the person has to correct them and do tshuva for them. So that's the overall explanation, but it's not yet a clear explanation. It's not absolutely clear, because fine, so we're excusing the behavior and saying at that level, at that stage of a person's development, that was not a chet. But now that they've been upgraded to a higher level, we look back at that with a more discerning eye. But it obviously wasn't something ideal, otherwise why would you be doing tshuva for it? If a person was doing things exactly as they should have been, then even if they progress to a higher level, they don't have to go back and do teshuva for it. That was acceptable at that time. Like a child before bar mitzvah did certain things which they were allowed to do, and you don't have to do teshuva when you become a bar mitzvah. So that implies that there was actually something lacking in what they did earlier. Now, that brings us back to the original question. How could we chas v'shalom suggest that Yaakov Avinu or the Alter Rebbe at some stage in their life did something which was not exactly as it should have been, and therefore when they upgrade to a high level, we look back at that critically and say you've got to do tshuva. So in order to understand that, we need to understand how radical progression works, because we're not talking about a tzadik who goes from level A to level B. We're talking about a tzadik now jumping from a particular reality to a whole different reality. So the Panim Yofis is mefarish meaning from Katointi Mikol HaChasadim. You see in the Panim Yofis explains this concept of Katointi. By the Aliyas and Neshamas from Ein Olam and Hechron Olam, we see something similar, that when Neshamas are elevated from one world to another, or one level within a world to another, which is a consistent process for tzadikim who are always growing and moving as Neshamas in Gan Eden, is Eides is ein Olam and the Hechron Olam, sein Zechesim lekatnos. Before neshama can progress to a radically different next world in Gan Eden, the neshama first goes through almost a shrinking period, which right now won't make much sense, but we'll explain what it means. Was das is, similar to what the Alter Rebbe says in the beginning of the introduction to Shari Yichud V'Emunah, that there's a concept of a tzadik having to fall in order to rise. So neshama has to go into, so to speak, a compacted reality, a constrained reality, in order to burst out into a far more developed reality. As the Panim Yofis says, so you've got a level of greatness that the tzaddik has attained, or the neshama is at, in Gan Eden, and now they're going to another level of greatness, which is radically different. In between the two of them is the katna sheni. There's a state of being, so to speak, limited or small. And that's what katointi means. But the aliyah was Yaakov had oile given from Chutzlaretz in Eretz Yisrael. The radical change that's about to happen for Yaakov Avinu coming from outside of Eretz Yisrael into Eretz Yisrael. So the aliyah given by him katointi before he gets into Eretz Yisrael. So he goes through this collapsed state. So a really good example of that we'll see is a really good example of that is when you're trying to understand something. So you understand something really, really thoroughly. That's greatness. You've understood it. But then, because you've understood it so well, that's what propels you to have very deep questions. Now, when you have those deep questions, they undermine your understanding, and you've now reduced your position. You're no longer in a position of strength and of clarity because you've got all of these questions. But the value of those questions is that they're going to take you to a whole different understanding, which is going to be far beyond the original understanding that you had. So to get from one level of greatness to another level of greatness, you have to go through this period of some level of collapse. Which explains why Yaakov Avinu is asking the Eibishter to save him from Esav. So what happened? Yaakov Avinu was given a bracha and assurance by the Eibishter. Then he went through his life and he grew in tremendous ways. Married, built a family, was mavar in the Nitzotzes Balavan, etc. Did tremendous things. And now he feels that the Eibishter's given him so much that kotointi. He's kind of in a state of almost spiritual collapse, meaning to say that he's feeling his lack, he's feeling his inadequacies. That's why he's asking the Eibishter to please save me from Esav, because I don't feel currently that I'm in that position of greatness. And in simple language, he was in a particular environment for a certain amount of time, and he's left that environment, he's on the road, that is just a physical manifestation of the spiritual state of Katonti. Now, the interesting thing is that when you're in that state of collapse, you're actually more advanced than you were in your greatness. Again, the person who really understands an idea, but now has these hard questions about the idea, is actually more advanced in their understanding than when they just thought they got the whole thing. Even though it's progression, but it's not progression in a state of limitation, and you need a lot of protection at that time. Again, like the person who's asking all those questions, they need to be held so that they don't remain only with the questions and don't find those answers. And that helps us to harmonize the explanation that Rashi gives and the explanation that Alter Rebbe gives on the words Katonti. When Rashi says, maybe I've been contaminated by chait, he doesn't mean chait in the sense of doing something against what the Eibishter wants, but rather chatoim, meaning I'm lacking something. Which means, relative to where I'm about to get to, right now, I'm actually in a limited or constrained position compared to where I'm going to get to. So it's not that there's something bad, it's not that there's something wrong, but because there's now an opportunity for tremendous growth, now I'm lacking all of the opportunity of that growth until I experience it. And that's directly related, as the Alter Rebbe says, to all the tremendous chesed that the Eibishter did for Yaakov. As the Alter Rebbe points out, all of that kindness that from the Eibishter doesn't just make him think, oops, I've used up a whole lot of credits. No, means the Eibishter has opened up a channel of connection to the Eibishter I haven't had before, and therefore where I am now is quite small and limited compared to where this is now going to take me. Considering, as the Alter Rebbe says, that the Eibishter has been so giving to me and so connected to me, my avodah now has to ramp up dramatically. Until I actually do that, I'm in a limited, almost fallen, collapsed state. So that's how it is with Yaakov Avinu. He's making this tremendous transition from the avodah of Chutz La'aretz to the avodah of Eretz Yisrael, and so he's in this transitional period in the middle, which is a period of almost, in a sense, collapse. It's progress, but it's not nearly where he needs to be. Similar thing happens with the Alter Rebbe before and after Peterburg. We very well know the real explosion of Hafatzas Hamayonis began after the Alter Rebbe was released from prison. So that illustrates how tremendous the growth and upgrade of the Alter Rebbe's experience was after being in prison. In Vergleich mit der Gadlus von Vor Peterburg, compared to the greatness, and the Alter Rebbe obviously had tremendous greatness before Peterburg, but it's nothing compared to the explosive greatness after Peterburg. Inzwischen der Gadlusche König Peterburg und sein Gadlusche Normalim Akademisch Lachrei Peterburg, now in between the two greatnesses, in the language of the Polim Yofas, the Gedula Achas and the Gedula Rishon and the Gedula Shnia. It's beim Gewinn der Ihnen von Katonti, the Meister von Alter Rebbe. In between, there's a state of collapse, which is the imprisonment, because during that time there's no expression of that greatness. The Meister hat doch mit sich gebracht viele ungreise Yisurim. The actual experience of the imprisonment, that was very difficult and very painful. Was the beim Alter Rebbe when he got to sign arrest, as the Rabbi Vayishlach said to the Alter Rebbe, complaining. Was hat so viel genommen auf seine Plätze? Complaining to the Alter Rebbe, why do you take so much on yourself? So viel Yisur Klal Yisur, Yisurim Shel Meila, Yisur HaNefesh, Yisur HaGuf. You took on the pain of the Jewish people, the pain of the Eibishter, so to speak, the pain of your soul, the pain of your body. Surely there are other ways that we could have used elevated spiritual means to be able to escape the pain. Was das hat gesagt about this from the Gedisrim from the Meiser Gufa, and there the Rabbi Yitzchak is speaking about the pain of being in the prison. We know as Chassidim that after that, the 3 hours when the Alter Rebbe was taken to the wrong address and he had to be in the house of the Misnagid, we know that was even worse. It was more painful for the Alter Rebbe than the entire period he spent inside the prison. So prison is not it's not a simple thing. It's a very difficult state. It's a katonti in the most extreme sense. Es verstandig als Begili ist das given Katnus in a viele the Gabe der Friedrich Madregas godless von Alter Rebbe. Everybody can agree that whatever greatness the Alter Rebbe is going to achieve after Peterburg, the greatness that the Alter Rebbe had before Peterburg is surely greater than the period that he was in the prison. The period of the prison is Katonti. Everything is being limited. Of a Mezen from the raid from the Rebbe Merena Rashab Nishma Satan, as the Rebbe Rashab says, as Chosh sich schwer azay zu sagen, even though it's really difficult to say these words, von deswegen ist doch das azay. That's how it was. As the Gilui Oir, was gekommen nach Peterburg, ist das gefahren nach Maimer Azal, Hazais, so the Rebbe Rashab says, how do you get the value out of the olive? You crush the olive, and that's how you get the oil. And the Rebbe Rashab saying that's what happened with the Alter Rebbe. When the Moshe is moving, as B'shas HaMais is given a katnas after the Gabe Koden Peterburg, which implies that during the state of being in prison, the Alter Rebbe was in a far more limited reality than he was as lead of Chassidim before going into prison. And you can see that from the Moshel, because when you crush the olive, when the Zayis looked into the press, while the olive is being crushed, it doesn't have any of its inherent values. It doesn't yet have what's going to emerge as its greatness. Because it hasn't yet produced the oil which it could use to illuminate. Nor does it have its previous greatness, which was when it was a fruit. Yes, of course, before you crush the olive, you don't have access to the oil. But it's still at least edible. It's something that can add value to human beings. But at the time of the crushing, the physical process of crushing the olive, at that time, the olive has no value to give. Not fruit, not oil. Dasselbe is moving Peterburg, and the same thing applies when the Alter Rebbe was in the prison. Besides the fact that obviously the explosion of Chassidus had not yet happened, because that's only going to happen after he leaves the prison. Now, so doch dann B'shas HaMaisach nicht gekannt sein gegen Hafotzes Chassidus in the Meifim with Alter Rebbe as getan for Peterburg. But the truth is, the Alter Rebbe locked in a prison is unable to teach Chassidus even at the level that he did so before going into the prison. Not there in was in jener Zeit is nicht gewinnt zum sein Chassidus, that concept that during the imprisonment the Alter Rebbe could not spread Chassidus is given a ger ich dem Alter Rebbe allein is something that's so to speak limited and hurt the Alter Rebbe himself. Or kemuven von in Avram Avinu, beisat nicht gekannt Chassadim sein bachnos orchim. We have a good example and precedent for this when Avram Avinu was unable to have guests. Because the Eibishter made it already hot day and there were no guests, he was in pain. Of a mikol shekain. Thus, it's a Avram Avinu wanted to do physical goodness. And he wanted to do them to non-Jewish people, to Arabs. Was before the Torah was given. So then can you imagine the Alter Rebbe being in prison after Matan Torah? Where he has the opportunity to affect Eden. Of Egan Talmud Torah, not just affect them physically, but to teach them Torah. And not be able to do that must have been terribly painful. Especially when you consider that it's to benefit the public. And especially because it's Chassidus that he wanted to teach. That's why the Alter Rebbe wrote Kotonti, not only to teach us how we should act in the future, but also to acknowledge what he had been through, the godless katnus and the greater godless, the exponential godless that follows. That's relevant to us because every year the events of these special dates recur. Everything that happens in the world originates in the Torah. So we're always going to read in the proximity of or on the day of Yitas Kislev those words. That's Yaakov Avinu's request, as it is the request of every single Nasi. As we well know, the word Nasi represents somebody who is a spark of Yaakov. From the Alter Rebbe, especially that was the request of the Alter Rebbe. They daven not only for themselves but for all of us, even though we might be going through a stage of constraint. So we should be able to see clearly the bracha that the Eibishter promised, that he will do good with us, and help us to grow into this incredible nation that has a tremendous impact, and obviously that we should see all of that fulfilled with the coming of Mashiach now.